You've revised your manuscript dozens of times and it still doesn't feel like it's working. Here's the thing, the problem is not that you're not putting in enough effort. If you're stuck, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not skilled enough or that you're not putting in the hours or even that you're missing something obvious. Most writers who feel stuck aren't stuck because revision is hard. And don't get me wrong, revision is difficult, but you're getting stuck because you're trying to fix the wrong problems. Let me explain. When you revise and you're solving the wrong problem, it creates an emotional roller coaster. You think, oh, thank goodness, I finally figured out what the problem is. So you get busy fixing it. When you finish, you read through it again, and what do you know? It doesn't feel like you actually fixed the problem. So you get sad because you've just spent all this time making the changes that you thought were finally going to help, and it didn't do what you wanted it to do. That's emotionally difficult. And when you're doing this over and over again, you can really get discouraged and start to wonder if your manuscript is even worth publishing. But here's the truth. It has very little to do with your manuscript. No first draft is worth publishing because they're all rough. It's all about the revision, and when we're making changes that aren't actually impacting your story structure, then we're not getting any closer to a manuscript that is ready to be published. So it's not your manuscript, it's how you're revising. And that emotional roller coaster you're on is what's manipulating your feelings. The good news, when you start solving the actual problems, you can get off that emotional roller coaster. You can start feeling more confident and more motivated to show up and make changes to your manuscript. And that ultimately just comes down to knowing what to actually change. So, how do writers end up on this emotional roller coaster in the first place? How do they misdiagnose their problems? Well, a lot of writers, if they're not asking for feedback, are using their intuition to guide them. They'll read through a scene and think, that doesn't feel so great, that's a little clunky. So they go in, they change some dialogue, or they read through and think, this is a little confusing. I didn't really say that very clearly. So they rewrite some lines to make it clearer. But they are rarely looking at what's happening beneath the words. And really what's happening beneath the words is where the structure to the story lives. Yes, the words create structure, but the structure is happening underneath them. It's this very interesting dance, and that's why a lot of writers tend to line edit before they actually start structurally editing. They think they might be doing structural editing, but what they're really doing is just line editing. They're making their prose sound more beautiful. They're making the dialogue flow better. And that's ultimately not going to fix the structure. You might also compare your manuscript to a published book and feel like your pacing isn't working. And it may not be. But here's the thing, pacing happens on multiple levels. It happens at the story structure level, happens at the scene level, and at the line level. There's so much that goes into pacing. So if you don't know where your pacing is slow or how your pacing is slow, you could be making changes based on a craft book or a published book and still be missing the actual problem. Now, some writers misdiagnose through feedback. They ask beta readers or peers for input. And the beta readers identify a symptom and prescribe a solution based on that symptom alone. Let me give you an example. There was a woman who wrote a book and sent it off to beta readers asking for feedback. One of her beta readers told her that the opening of the story was really confusing. So she recommended that she didn't start with action. Now, it's very common to encourage authors to start with action. So right off the bat, this advice feels a little suspect. It doesn't quite make sense. The beta reader was really trying to be helpful, that's clear. But she was prescribing a solution that did not fix the core problem. The symptom of the problem was that the opening was confusing. That's not the root problem. The root problem was that the scene wasn't anchored properly. That's what caused the confusion. Changing the scene so that it doesn't start with so much action does not anchor the scene. Thus, it doesn't get rid of the confusion. You could take out all of the action, start with something much more mild, maybe even a little boring, and the scenes would still be confusing. And that's why structural revisions are so hard. Here's what's important to understand. If the author had taken that advice and removed the action, thinking that would be the fix, she could have just made the scene feel even slower and probably less engaging. And that would have created new issues. So she'd keep tweaking the scene, making changes, trying to fix the problem, but ultimately all she'd end up doing is creating more confusion. And this is why a misdiagnosis of the root cause is so detrimental. So what does a root problem actually look like? A root problem is always going to be tied to something structurally. It's not a feeling and it's not a vibe. A feeling or a vibe points to the problem. It's the symptom. In my example, the beta reader was confused. That confusion was a symptom of an underlying problem. It's just like when you have a headache. The headache is not the problem, although it kind of feels like the problem. But the headache is caused by something else that's happening. You could be dehydrated, but if you weren't particularly well versed on dehydration and the symptoms of dehydration, you may not necessarily realize that your headache is being caused by that. So you do your best to treat it by taking some Tylenol. But if your headache really is caused by dehydration, then the Tylenol isn't really going to help. Drinking some water would probably help much more. That's the difference. You have to see those symptoms and use them as directions, as pointers to the actual problem. And the actual problem is always going to be tied to something structural. In the example that I gave, it was scene anchoring. Every single scene needs to be anchored. An anchored scene means that the reader knows whose point of view they're in, they know when the scene is taking place, and they know where the scene is taking place. If these three things are not clear in the scene is going to be confusing. Anchoring is not the only thing that can cause confusion, but it certainly is one. And when I looked at the scene this author provided, I saw that the scene was not anchored. There was a rapid shift in point of view, time, and place that lost the reader because the scene wasn't initially anchored and then it changed with no re-anchoring either. And that's where the confusion was being created. It wasn't the fact that things were happening quickly, it was that she hadn't anchored the reader in the scene. So here's what all this means. You're not stuck because you're not talented enough or because revision is just brutally hard. You're stuck because you're solving the wrong problems. And once you know what the actual problems are, everything changes. The revisions become manageable. The changes actually move the needle, and you can finally get off that emotional roller coaster. If you're worried that you might be line editing when you're trying to fix structural issues, then definitely check out the next video. I'll link it up here once it's available. But in that video, I'll show you how you can actually tell if you are structurally editing or if you're just improving your prose.